December 1944. The Ardennes were quiet the night before the storm. Snow covered the forests like a shroud, muffling every sound. The German army, frozen and desperate, waited for a miracle. They called it Wacht am Rhein, the last great offensive, Hitler's final gamble. To the men in the woods, it was simply hope disguised as orders. Colonel Hans Reiner stood beside a line of idling tanks, his breath fogging in the cold air. He was 51 years old, tall, hard-faced, a veteran of 2 wars. The Iron Cross on his coat had lost its shine. He had seen too much to believe in symbols. What he believed in now was fuel. The engines rumbled weakly. Somewhere nearby, a panzer stalled and coughed into silence. The cold bit into the men's bones, but the real enemy wasn't the weather. It was emptiness. Empty tanks, empty drums, empty promises. The Reich was running on fumes. "Any word from HQ?" Reiner asked his adjutant. "None, Herr Oberst. The Americans have fuel depots somewhere south of Stavelot." Reiner nodded slowly. "Then we take them." That was the plan. Strike hard, break through, seize Allied fuel, and drive to Antwerp before the enemy could regroup. Simple on paper, suicidal in reality. But orders were orders, and Reiner had been following them since before most of his men were born. At dawn, the artillery began. The snow lit up with fire. The forest shook as shells whistled overhead. The offensive rolled forward like an avalanche. Tanks, half-tracks, motorized infantry, all crashing westward through the mist. For the first time in years, the Germans advanced. Roads clogged with convoys, men shouted, engines roared. Reiner's unit pushed through villages still draped in Christmas decorations. American signs were ripped down, replaced with German ones. Civilians hid in their cellars, praying the tide of steel would pass. By noon, reports crackled over the radio. "Enemy fuel dump located outside Stavelot." Reiner's heart kicked. "Mobilize everything," he barked. "We move now." The column roared down the icy road, engines sputtering, headlights blacked out. Snow whipped across the windshields. The smell of exhaust and cordite filled the air. They reached the depot by dusk, a cluster of American trucks and fuel tanks hidden among trees, guarded by a handful of GIs. The firefight was brief. The Americans fought hard, but were outnumbered. Within minutes, the depot was in flames, tracer rounds slicing through the smoke. One of the fuel trucks exploded, painting the sky orange. Reiner's men cheered as they secured the perimeter. 50,000 gallons, someone shouted. "We've got it, Herr Oberst." Reiner climbed onto a truck and looked down at the shimmering black pools spreading through the snow. The smell of gasoline filled his lungs, sweet, intoxicating, like victory itself. For a moment, he felt something he hadn't in years: power. He turned to his adjutant. "Signal command. Tell them we have fuel for the advance." The man nodded, but Reiner could already see the doubt in his eyes. The victory felt wrong, too easy. The Americans had abandoned the depot in haste, leaving behind maps, rations, even cigarettes. It was as if they wanted the Germans to take it. Still, fuel was fuel. The men set to work, pumping gasoline into every vehicle they could find. Drums were loaded onto trucks, hoses hissed, engines came alive. For a few hours, it was as if the war had turned backward, as if the Reich had claws again. Reiner stood by a burning barrel, his face lit by orange light. "This," he said to no one in particular, "is life." Nearby, a soldier knelt, scooping fuel into jerry cans with his bare hands. "We'll make it to Antwerp now," he said. Reiner didn't answer. He watched the flames dance across the snow and thought of the map spread across his command table. Miles and miles of road between here and the sea. All of it hostile. That night, as his men celebrated, Reiner walked alone through the depot. The air hummed with the sound of pumps and engines. Every drop of gasoline felt like a heartbeat, a pulse of stolen life. Yet beneath the triumph lurked unease. The barrels were American, smooth, perfectly sealed, labeled in neat stenciled letters. The trucks were newer, cleaner, better than anything Germany had built in years. Even the tools the mechanics used were foreign, stamped "Made in USA." Reiner picked up a discarded ration tin. "Rations for 10 men," it read. He opened it and found food still warm. Bread, beans, even chocolate. The Americans had left everything behind but fear. He sat down on a crate and ate slowly, the sweetness burning his throat. For the first time, he realized that the enemy he was fighting didn't just have more. They had different. They fought a modern war, not a desperate one. When dawn came, the columns moved again. Tanks filled with American fuel rolled through the forests, engines purring. The snow crunched beneath their tracks. The men sang. For 24 hours, it felt like the old days. Speed, confidence, the illusion of destiny. But illusions don't last. By nightfall, reports came in. Roads blocked, bridges destroyed, fuel running low again. Reiner's adjutant handed him a clipboard. "Sir, we can't reach the next objective without refueling." Reiner stared at the paper. "How much do we have left?" "Maybe half. The trucks are burning more than expected." Reiner looked out over the line of vehicles, stretching into the trees, their engines idling hungrily. He imagined the barrels of gasoline draining, drop by drop, into the frozen ground. The victory at Stavelot had bought them hours, not salvation. He turned to his men. "We move until the tanks run dry," he said, "and then we walk." The men saluted, but the fire in their eyes was dimming. They knew. Everyone knew. That night, as the convoy pushed west, the captured fuel burned faster than expected. The tanks climbed a hill, engines coughing, exhaust glowing blue in the cold air. Reiner stood on his command half-track, watching the flicker of headlights fade into the fog. He could smell the gasoline again, strong, choking, irresistible. It was the scent of power and death at once. In the distance, thunder rolled, but it wasn't a storm. It was the sound of American artillery waking up. Reiner looked toward the west and whispered, "We took their fuel, but we'll never take their fire." The engines roared again, louder this time, defiant. And somewhere deep inside, he felt the first crack in the illusion that had kept him alive, the belief that Germany could still win. The road west was carved through mud and snow, a vein of ice that pulsed with engines. Tanks groaned uphill, trucks fishtailed in the slush. Soldiers pushed at stalled vehicles until their hands bled. The smell of fuel hung thick in the air, sweet, oily, temporary. Colonel Reiner rode in the lead half-track, map spread across his knees. Every mark on it was a promise. Fuel depots, supply routes, bridges still standing. But the paper already lied. Half the towns were gone, the bridges cratered, the roads choked with wrecks. "Report from 3rd Company," his adjutant shouted over the noise. "2 Panthers abandoned, out of fuel." Reiner didn't look up. "Strip them, leave nothing." The engines behind them roared, then coughed, then died one by one. Soldiers siphoned what they could into jerry cans. Every drop traded like gold. They called it liquid life. But life was short. By nightfall, they reached a crossroads. The sign read Stoumont, 5 kilometers. Beyond that, the road bent toward Liège. The dream. The impossible. Reiner ordered a halt. Men collapsed beside their vehicles, steam rising from their breath. Snow hissed as it touched the hot metal. He walked among them, boots crunching. The captured American drums stood in rows like black tombstones. Each stamped, U.S. Army, gasoline 80 octane. The white stars gleamed through the soot. He ran his glove over one label, thinking how much faith a nation must have to mark its lifeblood so openly. An engineer approached. Herr Oberst, the hoses froze again. Reiner nodded. Then heat them. We move at first light. But sir, heat them! He knew the truth. Every hour they waited, the Americans regrouped. The miracle fuel they'd captured was buying them speed, not strategy. Yet orders from higher command still spoke of Antwerp, of victory, of destiny. That night he gathered his officers in a barn lit by a single lantern. The air smelled of diesel and hay. Gentlemen, he said quietly, our timetable depends on fuel consumption. The Americans can lose 10 tanks and replace them in a day. We cannot lose 10 liters. Major Vogel frowned. We still have the advantage, sir. Do we? Reiner tapped the map. They fight with logistics. We fight with belief. Tell me which burns slower. Silence. Outside, an engine backfired, a sharp, dying sound that seemed to answer for them all. At dawn, the column moved again. The landscape blurred into gray. Frozen fields, smoking barns, abandoned jeeps. The Americans had fallen back, but not in panic. They were guiding the Germans deeper, stretching their supply lines thin. By midday, they hit the first ambush. Artillery thundered from unseen hills, shells bursting among the trucks. Fuel drums ignited instantly, turning the road into a wall of fire. Men screamed, engines shrieked. Black smoke climbed into the snow-white sky. Reiner dove into a ditch as flaming gasoline rained down. The heat seared his face. Through the haze, he saw something surreal. A German tanker kneeling beside a burning drum, trying to scoop fuel into his helmet before it vanished. "Leave it!" Reiner shouted. But the man didn't move. When the explosion came, it took them both off their feet. When the smoke cleared, the convoy was gone. Only wrecks and flames. Out of 50 vehicles, less than 20 still ran. The rest hissed quietly, their metal skins glowing red. Reiner stood amid the ruins, the snow around him melting into black slush. The air smelled of burnt rubber and failure. He turned to his adjutant. "Count what's left. Maybe 10,000 gallons. Half a day. Half a day to reach the next depot that probably no longer existed. Half a day before the engines went silent for good." That evening, they limped into a village whose name no one bothered to learn. The church steeple was gone, the houses hollow. Reiner commandeered the only building with a roof, the schoolhouse. Inside, children's drawings still hung on the walls. Suns, animals, aeroplanes. He stared at one, a picture of a smiling tank rolling under a rainbow. Beneath it, a word in German. Sieg. Victory. He felt something twist inside him. The war had stolen even the innocence of crayons. Outside, the men gathered around burning barrels, their faces ghostly in the light. Someone found a gramophone, played a waltz that cracked through the static. The music floated over the snow, fragile, absurd. Reiner looked up at the night sky, clear, frozen, infinite. "We thought the world ran on courage," he whispered. "But it runs on fuel." A young lieutenant overheard him. "Sir?" Reiner smiled bitterly. "Nothing. Just a thought." The next morning they pushed forward again, slower now, engines coughing like sick animals. The captured gasoline sputtered in the cold, thick with water and mud. Each mile felt heavier. At noon they crested a ridge and saw the impossible. Below them stretched an American supply column. Miles of trucks, fuel bowsers, bulldozers, ambulances, all moving smoothly, endlessly. It was a river of steel. Reiner's breath caught. His men stared in silence. One whispered, "How can they have so much?" Reiner didn't answer. In that moment, the truth was undeniable. They had not captured America's fuel. They had stolen a drop from an ocean. He watched the convoy snake through the valley, engines glittering in the sun, each truck marked with the same white star. It was beautiful in a terrible way, a choreography of abundance. He lowered his binoculars and said quietly, "This is what defeats empires." Then he gave the order to move, south this time, away from the valley, away from the dream of Antwerp. For the first time in his career, a retreat felt like wisdom. As the convoy turned, one of the engines coughed, sputtered, and died. Another followed. The men didn't curse. They simply waited, listening to the silence spread like frost. Reiner looked at the dead machines and whispered, "The plan burned out before the fuel did." The snow fell harder now, thick and silent. The roads turned to rivers of ice, and the German advance slowed to a crawl. What had begun as an offensive was dissolving into survival. Every movement cost gasoline, and every drop of gasoline felt like blood draining from a dying body. Colonel Reiner's column reached a bombed-out village near Trois Ponts. The town had been an American supply point before the retreat, and the evidence was everywhere. Abandoned trucks, empty crates, piles of equipment half buried in snow. His men scavenged greedily. "Food! Radios! Boots!" they shouted, rummaging through the ruins. But Reiner was drawn to something else, a set of intact American vehicles parked in a half-collapsed barn. He walked inside, brushing snow from his coat. 4 trucks stood there, their engines intact, their tanks full. Around them lay boxes of spare parts, oil drums, and a field generator still humming softly. On a table, someone had left open a logbook. Reiner picked it up. The handwriting was neat, methodical. Names, serial numbers, delivery routes. It was a map of an invisible war. Every line in that log was a heartbeat. Fuel from Cherbourg to Liège, ammunition from Le Havre to Bastogne, food from England to the Ardennes. Every route planned, every schedule precise. He ran his finger down a column of dates. There wasn't a single delay. He turned to his adjutant. "Do you see this?" "Yes, Herr Oberst." "This is their general." "Sir?" Reiner tapped the page. "This. Logistics. That's who we're fighting." He looked around the barn again. The rows of wrenches, the clean uniforms hanging on hooks, the American radio still tuned to a frequency somewhere far away. He turned the dial and heard voices speaking calmly over static. Coordinates, weather updates, reinforcements. It sounded like the hum of an empire that never slept. Back in Germany, their radios sputtered with propaganda and panic. Here, the enemy's frequencies carried mathematics and order. Reiner walked outside. The snow glittered in the moonlight. He could hear engines rumbling in the distance. American engines. steady, confident, endless. He thought of his own army's supply chain, battered horses, fuel drums on sleds, men pushing tanks that refused to start. They had fought the last mechanized war of the 19th century, and America was already fighting the first war of the future. Weiss approached, holding an American field manual he'd found. "Sir, look at this. It's a repair guide for trucks. It tells them what to do if a vehicle breaks down." Reiner flipped through it. Every step was illustrated. Replace the gasket. Check the oil pressure. Tighten the bolt. He laughed quietly. They trust their soldiers to think. We train ours to obey. Weiss frowned. "Maybe that's why they have so many trucks." Reiner nodded. "No, that's why their trucks keep moving." The next day, his men managed to repair one of the captured trucks. They used American tools, American fuel, even an American wrench. When the engine started, it purred perfectly, like an animal returning to life. The men cheered. Reiner stood beside it, watching the exhaust rise into the cold air. The sound was pure efficiency. "They build machines that don't need faith," he murmured. "Only fuel." Hours later, they came across a destroyed American convoy on the roadside. Dozens of burnt trucks, their frames twisted, cargo scattered. But what stunned them wasn't the wreckage, it was the content. Hundreds of jerry cans, still full. Crates of ammunition, food, blankets, boots, tools. All of it abandoned because the Americans could afford to leave it behind. One of the German sergeants shouted, "They waste more in a day than we have in a month!" Reiner didn't answer. He crouched beside a pile of canned meat, still sealed. "They don't waste," he said quietly. "They calculate. Every loss is already replaced." He looked at the serial numbers printed on the crates. Neat, uniform, systematic. Every part of the American army carried a number. Every number belonged somewhere. It was like watching a living equation. As they loaded what they could salvage, Reiner studied the burned-out road. The Americans had retreated not in chaos, but in rhythm. They had left wrecks like breadcrumbs for their own recovery teams to find later. Even in retreat, they were organized. That night, Reiner wrote in his notebook, "We believed the machine must serve the nation. They built a nation that serves the machine. And the machine serves everyone." He stared at the sentence for a long time. It sounded like surrender, but it wasn't. It was revelation. The next morning, a captured American sergeant was brought before him. The man was young, dirty, but defiant. He spoke a little German. "You won't get far," he said flatly. "You can take our fuel, but you can't take the system." Reiner looked at him curiously. "What system?" "The one that made that fuel. The one that made me. You'll run dry before we run out." The man wasn't boasting. He was stating a fact, and Reiner knew it. By noon they had moved again, using the captured trucks to pull what remained of their armor. Every mile they advanced, the sky grew louder with the sound of American planes. The Luftwaffe was gone, and the sky belonged to the enemy now. Through his binoculars, Reiner saw what the pilots saw. Columns of vehicles crawling through the snow like ants, each one burning through stolen fuel that could never be replaced. The irony was unbearable. They were feeding the American machine even as they fought it. When the first bombs fell, the trucks erupted like candles. Fuel turned the snow to fire. Men ran, shouting, burning. Reiner threw himself into a ditch as another explosion split the air. He covered his head and thought, absurdly, of that American sergeant's words, "You'll run dry before we run out." When the bombing ended, the silence was worse. Only the crackle of burning fuel remained. The captured trucks, the symbol of their brief triumph, were reduced to skeletons of metal. Reiner stood slowly. His face was streaked with soot. Around him, the snow was black. Weiss approached, limping, his coat smoking. "Sir, what now?" Reiner looked west, where the sky glowed faintly with the reflection of distant fires. "Now we watch," he said quietly. "We watch how empires die." He knew then that the war wasn't lost because they lacked courage, or even fuel. It was lost because they had fought an opponent that could turn abundance into discipline, technology into morality. They had worshipped power. The Americans had perfected motion. The cold came back with vengeance. January 1945. The snow fell like ash, silent and merciless. The roads that had once thundered with engines were now graveyards of steel. The tanks stood motionless, their tracks frozen into the ice. The last breath of the Ardennes offensive had escaped into the wind. Colonel Hans Reiner walked between the silent hulks, his boots crunching in the snow. The barrels were all empty now. Every drum of stolen fuel burned or drained. The only sound was the soft hiss of the wind through shattered engines. Men crouched beside their tanks, rubbing their hands over small fires made from crates and broken parts. They no longer spoke of Antwerp, or victory, or even survival. The war had turned into a waiting room. A lieutenant approached, breath clouding in the cold. "Herr Oberst, the last truck stopped an hour ago. We have no reserves left." Reiner didn't respond. He just nodded. The silence was worse than defeat. For weeks they had fought, bled, and burned through the illusion that the Reich could still command the future. Now the illusion had evaporated, leaving only the sound of shivering metal. He looked out across the field. Hundreds of vehicles, tanks, half-tracks, jeeps, frozen in place like an army turned to stone. The snow covered them slowly, erasing insignia, smoothing out edges, making them all the same color. German, American. It didn't matter anymore. The machines were all equal in death. Weiss approached, stamping his feet for warmth. "Sir, the men are asking, what happens now?" Reiner exhaled slowly. "Now? We wait for fuel that will never come." Weiss hesitated. "And if it doesn't?" Reiner smiled faintly. "Then we walk home." He tried to sound calm, but inside he felt the weight of something larger than defeat. It was extinction. He had spent his life mastering the art of war, only to realize that war itself had changed into something mechanical, something mathematical, something that no longer needed men like him. He walked over to one of the tanks, its turret frosted with ice. He ran his gloved hand over the iron, feeling the cold bite through the leather. The vehicle still bore an American bullet hole through its side, a neat, perfect wound. The tank was dead, but beautiful, like a monument to ambition. Nearby, a young soldier sat on a crate, staring at his empty fuel can. "We stole the enemy's fire," he muttered. "And now we freeze in its shadow." Reiner looked at him, surprised. The boy couldn't have been more than 19. His face was raw from the wind, his eyes hollow. "Where did you learn to speak like that?" The soldier shrugged. "I used to read poetry before the war." Reiner almost laughed. "Poetry? In times like these?" The boy met his gaze. What else is left when the machines stop? The question lingered in the cold air. By noon, the first American planes appeared, tiny specks against the grey sky. The men didn't even run for cover. There was no point. The bombers didn't bother to attack. They didn't need to. The Germans were already dead where they sat, their weapons useless, their engines frozen. Reiner watched as one of the planes banked low, its silver wings flashing in the sunlight. He could almost see the pilot's face. The plane passed overhead, dropping leaflets instead of bombs. They fluttered down like snow. Reiner caught one. It was a simple message in German. Without fuel, no war. Without war, no death. Surrender. He stared at it for a long moment, then folded it neatly and slipped it into his coat pocket. That night, the temperature dropped even lower. The fires went out one by one. Men wrapped themselves in tarps and blankets, huddled in silence. Some prayed, others stared at the stars, wondering if anyone still believed in victory. Reiner sat alone inside the shell of a broken truck. The steering wheel was cold under his hands. He imagined turning the key, hearing the engine roar back to life, feeling the vibration of purpose again. But nothing happened, just the creak of frozen metal. He thought of the American convoy he had seen days earlier, an endless river of motion. For them, fuel was just another number, another equation solved long ago. For the Germans, it had become faith, and faith had run dry. He took out his notebook and wrote, "Our empire didn't die in battle. It ran out of gasoline." He closed the book, tucked it into his coat, and leaned back against the cold seat. Through the broken windshield, the sky was a deep, impossible blue. He could see the faint glimmer of the moon behind the clouds. Weiss appeared at the door. "Sir, command says we are to hold position until further notice." Reiner smiled faintly. "Further notice from whom? God?" Weiss hesitated. "Berlin, sir." Reiner laughed, the sound dry and hollow. "Berlin has no fuel either." For a moment, they both stood there in silence, listening to the faint hum of distant engines, American, not German. It was the sound of inevitability. By morning, the snow had buried half the tanks. The others were black silhouettes in the dawn. The men began abandoning them, walking along the road in small groups, rifles slung, boots sinking deep into the drifts. Some left their helmets behind. The sound of their footsteps was soft, like the ticking of a clock winding down. Reiner watched them go. He didn't stop them. There was nothing left to command. He turned one last time to look at his column. The vehicles stood like monuments to the arrogance of men who believed they could outrun reality. The barrels gleamed faintly in the light, empty but proud. He whispered, "Without fuel, no empire. Without humility, no peace." Then he began walking too. The crunch of his boots faded into the wind. Behind him, the tank stood silent, waiting for spring. Block 5. The Realization. The surrender came not with a roar, but with a sigh. When the last engines went silent, when the last radio cracked and died, the men simply stopped. They walked out of the woods with their hands up, too tired to feel shame. Snow fell on their helmets, melting into grey rivulets down their faces. The war, at least for them, was over. Colonel Hans Reiner was among the last to surrender. He stood on a ridge overlooking the valley, a valley filled with dead machines. The white stars on American trucks gleamed even through the smoke. He had spent weeks fighting for fuel, and now the fuel itself was everywhere, flowing, burning, dripping uselessly into the snow. When the American patrol found him, he didn't resist. He simply handed over his pistol and nodded.
"For what it's worth," he said in English, "you were better prepared."
The sergeant who took his weapon looked at him curiously. "Better prepared? We just had more gas." Reiner smiled. "That's what preparation means." They brought him to a makeshift command post, a farmhouse half destroyed by shellfire. Inside, an American colonel sat behind a desk littered with maps and coffee cups. His uniform was rumpled, his eyes bloodshot, but there was a calm about him that Reiner had never seen in a German officer. "Name?" the American asked. "Hans Reiner, Colonel, Wehrmacht." The man extended his hand. "Colonel David Morgan, U.S. Army. Sit." Reiner hesitated, then sat. Morgan poured coffee into a tin cup and slid it across the table. "You've been fighting near Stavelo?" "Yes." "You guys moved fast." "Too fast, maybe." Reiner shrugged. "We had help. From your fuel depots." Morgan smiled thinly. "Yeah, we noticed. 50,000 gallons, right?" Reiner nodded. 50,000 gallons.
It felt like salvation.
Morgan leaned back. "And now?" Reiner stared into his cup. "Now it feels like a joke." They sat in silence for a moment, the only sound the wind whistling through the cracks in the wall. Then Morgan said, "You know that fuel you took? We replaced it in 2 days. Convoys from Antwerp, from Le Havre. We had ships lined up before you even got there." Reiner looked up slowly. 2 days? "Yeah. You think we'd plan a war without a backup?" The words hit harder than any shell. 2 days. They had stolen the blood of an empire, and it had replaced it faster than they could even use it. Reiner leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "In Germany, we fight for every liter. We ration it, worship it, bleed for it. You treat it like water." Morgan shook his head. "Not water. Blood. We just make sure the heart never stops beating." He tapped the map on his desk. Every line was a supply route, every dot a depot, every symbol a pulse. "You see this, Colonel? This is how we fight wars. Not with flags, with schedules." Reiner studied the map. Rail lines, truck routes, arrows connecting ports to fronts. It looked more like an anatomy chart than a battle plan. "It's a living thing," he murmured. Morgan nodded. "And you can't kill something that big with tanks. You'd have to stop everyone. Every farmer, every welder, every woman at every assembly line. We don't fight alone." Reiner sat back, silent. He felt small, not humiliated, but diminished, as if his entire world had been carved down to scale. "Tell me," he said finally, "how do you make them work like that? Without orders, without fear?" Morgan smiled. "You don't make them. You give them something to build for. A paycheck, a home, a promise. Fear runs out. Hope doesn't." Reiner looked down at his hands. They were cracked, filthy, trembling slightly. "Hope," he repeated quietly. "We used to have that once." Morgan poured himself another coffee. "Then maybe you'll have it again, after this mess." Reiner met his gaze. "If we survive." "You will. Germans are good at rebuilding." The irony stung, but it wasn't cruel. It was true. That night, Reiner was moved to a prisoner compound. The camp was quiet, lit by floodlights, surrounded by barbed wire. Inside, men slept in rows, their uniforms tattered, their faces gaunt. Yet the guards treated them like men, not beasts. They gave them food, blankets, even cigarettes. Reiner lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The sound of generators outside hummed like distant thunder, steady, endless. The Americans had power to waste. He realized he hadn't seen a blackout since his capture. Every bulb in the camp burned bright. He thought of Berlin, the darkness, the hunger, the silence broken only by air raid sirens. Here, even captivity felt illuminated. He turned his head toward Weiss, who slept on the cot beside him. "We thought we could win by being harder," he whispered. But they were smarter, kinder even. Weiss stirred but didn't wake. Reiner closed his eyes. He dreamed of roads, long, straight, endless, filled with trucks that never stopped. Weeks passed. The camp routine was simple: roll call, meals, work, silence. The Americans were efficient but not cruel. Reiner began to understand the rhythm of their world. The guards changed shifts exactly on time. Supplies arrived at the same hour each day. Even the mail came like clockwork. It was discipline without tyranny. One morning, Morgan visited the camp. He found Reiner sitting alone, cleaning his boots. "How's the coffee here?" he asked. "Too good for prisoners," Reiner replied. Morgan grinned. "We don't ration dignity. You might want to try that back home." Reiner looked up. "Back home? There's nothing left." "Then you'll build something new." Reiner studied him for a moment. "You really believe that, don't you? That work can rebuild the world?" "I do," Morgan said, "because that's how we built ours." Later, when Morgan left, Reiner sat for a long time in silence. Then he opened his notebook and wrote, "We thought power meant control. They know power means consistency. That's why they win. We burn. They endure." He closed the notebook and looked out at the campyard. The American flag fluttered above the gates, not as a threat, but as a reminder. For the first time in his life, Reiner didn't feel hatred when he saw it. He felt envy, and something even more dangerous: respect. Spring, 1946. The train to Germany crawled through a continent of ghosts. Town after town slid past the window. Shattered churches, burned stations, children standing barefoot in the mud, waving at soldiers who were no longer soldiers. The smoke from the engine mixed with the ruins like breath from an exhausted world. Colonel Hans Reiner sat in a corner seat, his uniform stripped of insignia. His reflection in the glass looked older, smaller. He had left for the front as a man of steel. He was returning as a man of thought. Across from him sat Weiss, thinner now but alive. They spoke little. There was nothing left to argue about. The war had ended, but the silence it left behind was heavier than the noise that had filled it. When the train reached Frankfurt, Reiner stepped onto the platform and froze. The city was gone. Whole neighborhoods reduced to gravel and dust. Only chimneys and twisted girders stood against the sky like broken fingers. He walked through the streets slowly, his boots crunching on glass. People moved through the ruins like shadows, carrying buckets, tools, memories. The air smelled of ash and bread, destruction and survival in the same breath. He passed the shell of a factory. The roof collapsed, the windows blown out, but inside he saw movement. Men and women were clearing debris, stacking bricks, setting up tables. Someone had hung a sign made of scrap wood. Wiederaufbau beginnt heute. Reconstruction begins today. Reiner stopped and watched them. Their faces were thin but determined. They worked without shouting, without orders. They were building something, not for glory, but for necessity. He remembered what the American colonel had said. Fear runs out. Hope doesn't. Now, for the first time, he saw it with his own eyes. Weiss joined him, wiping soot from his hands. They say there will be food deliveries soon, from the Americans. Reiner nodded. They won the war, and now they'll win the peace. Weiss frowned. And us? Reiner looked at the workers again. Maybe we'll learn to build instead of conquer. In the months that followed, Reiner worked alongside the civilians, clearing rubble, repairing roads, salvaging steel. He had no command, no rank, no privilege, but the work steadied him. The rhythm of rebuilding reminded him of the American factories he had seen. The hum, the order, the quiet cooperation. He saw it spreading, not as occupation, but as imitation. New machines arrived from America, new systems, new blueprints, new words, productivity, management, efficiency. Germany was learning again, this time not how to destroy, but how to endure. In 1948, when the new Deutsche Mark was introduced, Reiner held the crisp bills in his hand and thought of that conversation in the farmhouse. You give them something to build for. Now he understood. Money wasn't power. It was motion. It kept the heart beating. By 1950, factories rose again on the same foundations that had once burned. Siemens, Bosch, Volkswagen, all reborn. The air filled once more with the sound of engines, but this time it wasn't war. It was recovery. Reiner visited one of the plants near Stuttgart. He watched the assembly line move, smooth, steady, efficient. The men at the line didn't salute anyone. They simply worked, confident, proud. A foreman passed by and greeted him warmly. We make 10,000 engines a month now, for cars, not tanks. Reiner smiled. Better engines for a better cause. Outside the factory, children rode bicycles along new paved roads. The fields were green again. The same land that had buried millions now fed them. Weiss found him there one afternoon, leaning against a fence, staring at the horizon. You still think about it? He asked. Reiner nodded. Every day, the sound of engines, the smell of fuel. But it doesn't frighten me anymore. It reminds me that we survived. He took out his old notebook, the one he had carried through the Ardennes. Its pages were brittle, yellowed, filled with notes, sketches, questions. On the last page he wrote, They defeated us without hatred. They built a world that never runs dry. And in losing to them, we learned how to live. Years passed. Germany changed again. Faster, freer, louder. The Wirtschaftswunder turned rubble into prosperity. Highways spread across the land like veins, carrying motion, trade, life. The sound of engines became the soundtrack of peace. In 1958, Reiner retired from public service. He lived in a small house near Munich, quiet, orderly, filled with books instead of medals. On his desk sat one relic, an empty American fuel can, dented, its white star faded. He kept it, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. Every morning he would walk to the hill outside town, where the highway cut through the valley. Trucks thundered past, carrying goods from factories to ports. The smell of diesel hung in the air. He would close his eyes and listen. The rhythm was the same as it had been in 1944. The hum of industry, the pulse of machines. But now, it was not the sound of conquest. It was the sound of civilization. One morning, Weiss visited him for the last time. They sat together, watching the traffic below.
"It's strange," Weiss said, "to think that we fought to stop this world, and now we live because of it."
Reiner nodded. Maybe that's how history works. The victors build the future. The defeated maintain it. Weiss smiled. And you? Do you regret it? Reiner thought for a long time. No. Regret is for men who didn't learn. I learned enough. That evening, as the sun set, the highway lights flickered on one by one. The trucks kept moving, headlights cutting through the dusk like veins of light. Reiner watched until the horizon turned dark. Then he whispered softly, "They built a machine that outlived the war. And now we are all part of it." He stood, his old bones stiff but steady, and walked back toward town. The sound of engines followed him, steady, eternal. The war was over. The lesson never was.